began with silence. On a gray February morning in 1944, the Atlantic lay flat as hammered tin 50 miles east of Cape Cod. A Navy test boat drifted under low clouds, engines idling at half-turn, its crew listening to the pulse of the destroyer escort USS Cates somewhere beyond the mist. Moments earlier, Cates had sent a full-power QHB sonar burst across the water, a clean, bell-bright ping that should have ricocheted off the test vessel's steel hull and rushed back within seconds. The operator waited for the echo, pencil hovering above the chart. Nothing. He turned the gain knob. Still nothing. The screen stayed blank. The headphones hissed with empty sea. For the first time in years of anti-submarine drills, sound itself seemed to vanish. Below the surface, the experiment's secret rolled silently through cold water, a 12-foot hull section of a new alloy the Navy had no name for. Its purpose was not strength but silence. It absorbed vibration instead of reflecting it. That morning's missing echo would mark the birth of what later analysts called America's secret steel. The disappearance could not have come at a more desperate hour. By 1943, the Allies had fought the U-boat war to a costly equilibrium. Convoys survived, but barely. Every new sonar model pushed the Germans to refine countermeasures, rubber coatings, decoy noisemakers, deeper dives into cold layers that bent sound away. What had begun as a technological advantage was turning into a duel of acoustics. Destroyer captains joked grimly that the ocean had learned to lie. Inside the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, the search for truth fell to engineers who lived among oscilloscopes and notebooks that smelled of machine oil. One of them, metallurgist Robert Selby, was 32 years old and already half-deaf from test explosions. He was convinced the answer lay not in better sonar but in smarter steel. Conventional hulls, he wrote, ring like church bells underwater. To survive, a submarine had to become not merely quiet but acoustically soft. Selby's team began mixing trace metals, nickel for ductility, manganese for grain strength, vanadium for resonance control, melting them in crucibles barely large enough for a dinner plate of alloy. Each sample was struck with a hammer, each tone etched onto phonograph paper. Most rang clear and high. A few produced a dull, choking thud. Those sheets, Selby noticed, showed microscopic pores where molten steel had trapped gas and cooled unevenly. Instead of transmitting vibration, the cavities scattered it. The discovery was accidental but profound. Imperfection could be a weapon. They labeled the mix composition 14B. In tests, it was brittle, hard to weld, and corroded quickly in salt water, everything shipbuilders hated. Yet when a sonar pulse struck it, energy dissipated through internal grain fractures like rain through sand. Selby proposed lining submarines with panels of this dead steel, backed by rubber dampers. His superiors were skeptical. The Bureau of Ships barely kept up with Liberty ship production. Exotic alloys sounded like luxury, but anti-submarine officers were losing too many men to faith in physics that no longer worked. A memo reached Admiral King's desk. Authorized limited test of acoustic absorbent plating, NRL supervision. In late autumn 1943, an obsolete S-class boat at the New London base was gutted and fitted with a midsection of the new metal. The welders cursed. The seams cracked if overheated. When the boat slipped into the Thames River for trials, technicians on shore trained QCB sonar on her hull. The echo dropped by more than half. It wasn't invisibility, but it was the first measurable defeat of sonar by design, not by luck of water layers. One officer wrote, "The sea swallowed her outline." That single sentence unlocked funding and fear in equal measure. If America could hide a submarine from its own detectors, what would happen if Germany found the same trick first? A secret order formed under the innocuous title Acoustic Hull Research Section 14th. Shipyards in Groton and Portsmouth received classified billets for special composition welding. Workers noticed the steel looked different, blue-black sheen, heavier than HY80, and that supervisors carried clipboards stamped with red tape marked quiet skin. By December, whispers ran through the yards. A new kind of sub was coming, one that wouldn't ping back. The men building it didn't know they were hammering the edges of an acoustic revolution. When the prototype hull finally slid into the water, technicians along the pier held their breath, waiting for the sound that had defined modern naval warfare, the returning ping. Instead, the ocean gave them silence so complete it felt like a void. Someone wrote in the log, "Echo lost." It was both a test result and an omen. That was how America's invisible steel announced itself, not with a roar but with the absence of one. And within months, that silence would begin rewriting how nations hunted beneath the waves. By early 1944, the Atlantic had become an underwater chessboard of pulses and echoes. Every convoy, every escort, every lurking submarine moved inside that invisible web of sound. To the men who fought there, sonar was both savior and tormentor, a friend when it warned them early, a betrayer when it gave them away. Ships pulsed the ocean in disciplined rhythm, each ping a heartbeat of survival. And yet, even as Allied sonar grew sharper, the Germans learned to fade. It was a cruel paradox. Victory in detection meant forcing the enemy to evolve. German scientists at Kiel and Hamburg had begun coating U-boat hulls with synthetic rubber mats called alberic. The material absorbed a fraction of the sonar energy, scattering the rest. It wasn't perfect, but it reduced detection range by hundreds of yards. Allied convoys started losing boats again in areas once considered safe. The phrase contact lost appeared too often in war diaries. American commanders realized that sonar, once their clean instrument of certainty, was now being bent by those who understood its limits. That realization reached back to the quiet labs in Washington. Selby's alloy composition 14B suddenly moved from curiosity to necessity. What began as a metallurgical puzzle now felt like an arms race conducted at frequencies no human ear could hear. Inside the Naval Research Laboratory, experiments intensified. Sonar technicians built glass tanks filled with salt water and steel samples. They transmitted pings through transducers, measured echoes, and charted each alloy's loss factor, the percentage of sound that never returned. The numbers told their own story. Traditional hull steel lost about 8–10% of a sonar pulse. Rubber-coated plates lost 20. Selby's composition reached nearly 60. For the first time, engineers saw data that suggested stealth could be manufactured. But every solution created its own friction. The alloy corroded twice as fast as conventional steel and cracked at weld joints under pressure. Deep-sea pressure tests simulated depths of 300 feet, common patrol limits for fleet submarines, and many panels failed. A material that could hide sound might not survive the ocean's crush. That tension defined the next 6 months, how to balance invisibility with endurance. To solve it, Selby partnered with a younger engineer from the Bureau of Ships, Lieutenant J.G. Carl Yates, who had spent his pre-war years in Detroit testing car frames. Yates thought like an industrial designer. He didn't want to change the hull, only how it wore its skin. Together they imagined a sandwich of old and new, an inner hull of proven steel, an outer shell of composition 14B bonded with a thin layer of vulcanized rubber. The idea was elegant and dangerous. No shipyard had ever built such a hybrid before. In March 1944, the Navy authorized construction of an experimental boat based on that concept, R-59, drawn from a retired pre-war design. Its hull plates arrived at Groton under sealed manifests labeled boiler sections. Welders noticed the smell, a faint metallic sweetness unlike normal steel, and that the pieces sparked dull orange instead of white. They worked in shifts behind blackout curtains guarded by Marines. The Navy's secrecy went so far that even the yard superintendent didn't know the vessel's true purpose. When R-59 was launched, observers described its skin as oddly muted. It didn't ring when struck with a hammer. It made a soft clack like thick glass. Engineers installed sensitive hydrophones and recording gear inside, hoping to hear how the sea spoke to it. In its first submerged test, sonar crews aboard escort vessels found themselves staring at half-strength returns. By shifting depth slightly, dropping below a cold thermal layer, the sub's echo nearly vanished. The discovery thrilled and unsettled them. It proved that sound didn't behave in straight lines. It bent with temperature, salinity, and motion. Combined with the steel's absorption, the effect was stunning. The R-59 could hide beneath its own acoustic shadow, but it also showed how fragile stealth could be. When the sub accelerated past 8 knots, cavitation from its propellers drowned everything in white noise, revealing its position instantly. Quietness, they learned, was not a switch. It was a state of balance easily lost. By the 5th day of tests, the destroyer USS Cates, the same ship that had failed to detect the prototype section off Cape Cod, was ordered to simulate an attack. Sonar operators reported a faint contact, then nothing. The convoy commander scribbled in his log, "Target faded. Possible malfunction." Yet the equipment worked perfectly. The R-59 had slipped beneath the pings and surfaced undetected a mile astern, signaling success with a single green flare. What happened that week reached the Navy's upper echelons faster than any report from the Atlantic front. The results were not shared with allies, not even with the British Admiralty. America had found a material that could rewrite the language of sonar, and secrecy became its armor. In 10 minutes of test data, a decade of naval doctrine had gone quiet. The lesson was simple and terrifying. If the ocean could no longer return sound, then nothing beneath it was truly knowable. By mid-1944, the shipyards of the East Coast had become orchestras of controlled chaos. Rivets hammering, cranes whining, acetylene torches hissing like serpents in the night. Yet amid that industrial thunder, a few corners worked in unnatural quiet. Behind corrugated walls marked only with numerical codes, men labored on hull sections wrapped in tarpaulins. They were told the material was sensitive to light and temperature. They were not told it was classified above top secret. Groton, Connecticut was the epicenter. There, under the direction of the Electric Boat Company, 2 sheds along the Thames River were cordoned off under Navy contract XR-147. The foreman joked that even the rats needed clearance to get in. Only about 30 workers held the full briefing, each sworn to the Espionage Act. They knew the alloy by a simple name: silent skin. The project goal was whispered, not written: make a submarine the sea could not hear and sonar could not find. The challenges were immediate. The new steel warped at high temperatures. Welders discovered they had to adjust flame angles and cool each seam with brine spray. Even then, cracks spidered across the joints if the ambient humidity changed. Every failed weld meant wasted hours and dangerous questions. One young welder, confused by the material's behavior, tried to cut it with a torch and nearly suffocated when it emitted a pale gas that displaced oxygen. Supervisors logged the incident as minor, but from that day, workers wore respirators and gloves. Selby's alloy had proven itself in test plates. Now it had to survive the brutality of the sea. The prototype submarine under construction, R-59's successor, would be longer, heavier, and equipped for extended patrols. Its outer hull featured overlapping acoustic plates bonded to the main structure with layers of rubber compound. Each plate was about the size of a briefcase and had to be aligned in perfect sequence, like scales on a fish. When viewed under lamplight, the hull shimmered with faint blue-gray reflections as though it absorbed color itself. Carl Yates, the lieutenant who designed the bonding process, visited the site almost daily. He moved through the sheds with a clipboard, noting temperature readings, checking sealants, reminding men to file their scrap. Even the smallest offcut was tagged and locked in storage. One afternoon, a visiting supply officer asked him why. Yates answered simply, "Because silence costs more than gold." Outside the sheds, the war thundered on. Newspapers spoke of Normandy and Saipan, of bombers crossing France and Marines inching through coral sands. The men in Groton knew little of that. Their world was heat, steel, and secrecy. Rumors filled the void. Some said the hull contained magnetic shielding. Others whispered it could bend light underwater. The truth was stranger. It could bend sound, not entirely, but enough to make a destroyer doubt its own ears. When the vessel was finally launched in late June 1944, no ceremony marked the event. Only a few officers and engineers stood on the pier as the sub slipped into the river, under overcast skies. The logbook noted its name as Experimental Vessel 9, but the crew who would test it called her Ghostfish. She carried no torpedoes, no guns, only instruments, hydrophones, and a skeleton crew of technicians. Their orders were to run silent, cross the continental shelf, and allow escort ships to hunt them. The escorts, unaware of her modifications, reported a frustrating pattern of contacts lost. The sea seemed to swallow their pings. Those trials revealed new mysteries. At certain speeds, the hull emitted a faint, low-frequency hum, inaudible to humans but picked up by equipment. It came from minute vibrations where the acoustic plates overlapped. The engineers noted it, then solved it by filling gaps with a viscous resin imported from DuPont's experimental lab. The fix worked too well. Sonar contact disappeared completely for almost 10 minutes of continuous sweeps. A commander observing from the escort ship later wrote, "It was like chasing a ghost through fog with blindfolded eyes." For Selby, this success was both triumph and warning. The alloy had turned from curiosity to weapon. Every innovation carried the same question: how much silence was safe? A submarine that left no trace on sonar could vanish without record, friend or foe. Commanders debated the ethics quietly. If the enemy copied it, convoys could be slaughtered without warning. Yet no one dared slow the research. The Atlantic was still a graveyard, and silence, however fragile, meant survival. In the weeks that followed, the shipyard forged 2 more hulls using improved techniques. The Navy called them partial quiet boats, hybrids with acoustic sections only on their outer rings. They were intended for data collection, but rumors spread that one would soon be deployed with a combat patrol group. For now, only engineers knew the truth. The ocean itself had become their laboratory, and every lost ping was a new page in its uncharted science. The shipyards worked day and night, but the loudest thing inside those walls was the absence of sound. The Atlantic in summer carried a deceptive calm. Its gray swells gleamed with sunlight that masked the cold below, and the air smelled faintly of diesel and salt. The Ghostfish slipped into that stillness at dawn on July 18, 1944, under escort of 2 destroyer escorts, the USS Cates and the USS Fisk. Officially, the Navy listed it as a target vessel for anti-submarine exercises. Unofficially, it was a live test of a weapon that could not yet be named. Its crew of 24 men was unlike any submarine complement before it. Half were engineers, a few were sonar specialists, and only 4 were trained submariners. Lieutenant Commander Alan Reese, a quiet man with 20 Atlantic patrols behind him, commanded the boat. He had agreed to the assignment without asking too many questions. All he knew was that this submarine had to be found and killed in simulation. His orders: give the escorts a fair hunt and survive. On the first run, Ghostfish submerged to 200 feet and set course across the continental shelf. The escorts fanned out above, their sonar arrays sweeping rhythmic arcs. Each ping echoed through the hull with a faint metallic tick. Then, as the submarine passed under a colder layer of water, the sound changed. The ping softened, dissolved, and vanished. Reese leaned over the chart table. "They've lost us," a technician whispered. They waited 10 seconds, then 20. The next sonar burst came faint, distant, confused. The escort's equipment registered 2 echoes instead of 1. The alloy had split the return into separate reflections, misleading the operators. Reese logged the moment in pencil. Aero 741. Contact lost. Alloy function confirmed. For the next hour they played cat and mouse. Whenever the Ghostfish rose toward warmer layers, the destroyers reacquired her. When she descended again, she disappeared. Engineers took readings, adjusting the rubber bonding temperature and tracking how water density bent the sonar pulse. They discovered that by holding to a narrow thermal band, the submarine could create an acoustic mirage, a false target above or below her real position. The ocean became a hall of echoes. In 10 minutes, that discovery would cause chaos. At 09:20, the Cates reported a solid sonar contact ahead. Depth charges armed with practice fuses were loaded. The destroyer closed to attack speed, sonar tracing a firm line. Yet below, the Ghostfish was nowhere near the predicted depth. The pulse had ricocheted off the thermocline and back from a pocket of warm water. When the charges detonated, they burst harmlessly 200 feet above. The pressure wave rippled through the hull, but the reading stayed steady. On the surface, the escorts believed they'd scored a kill. Reese surfaced an hour later right between them, raising a periscope flag to signal "survived." The observers aboard Cates stared in disbelief. They had watched the screens, heard the pings, dropped the charges, and still been fooled by silence. That week's exercises rewrote naval assumptions faster than any weapon test before. Each night after the Ghostfish returned to port, technicians replayed tape reels of sonar recordings. On spectrograms, the alloy's behavior appeared as blank bands, intervals where sound energy seemed to disappear entirely. The data defied explanation. Yates suggested that microscopic air pockets trapped in the steel were scattering sound waves sideways instead of back to source. Selby, more cautious, noted that the metal's molecular structure itself might be altering the speed of sound within it, bending the returning echo. Either way, the result was unprecedented. Stealth born from imperfection. The Navy's observers were torn between fascination and fear. They saw what every commander dreads: technology that renders old defenses obsolete. Admiral King's office requested a full report under immediate classification. Only 4 copies were made. One went to the Bureau of Ships, one to the Naval Research Laboratory, one to the Atlantic Fleet's anti-submarine division, and the last vanished into a safe under special projects. None mentioned Ghostfish by name. She became simply Vessel Q. When the crew disembarked after their 10th patrol, they found themselves under orders not to speak of anything they had seen or heard. Reese was reassigned to a training command in Key West. Selby and Yates returned to Washington, where a larger meeting waited, one that would decide whether the alloy should become operational or buried under secrecy. Before leaving Groton, Reese signed the final line in his patrol log. "The sea no longer tells the truth." Those words would travel farther than any sonar ping, echoing through hallways of men who understood their meaning. The ocean had always been treacherous. Now it could be deceitful by design. By August 1944, the Ghostfish had completed 5 major test patrols without a single confirmed sonar hit. The data was overwhelming. Acoustic absorption between 50 and 70% depending on temperature and depth. On paper, the alloy had outperformed every known anti-sonar technique, even the Germans' Albrecht coating. But as the Navy prepared to declare victory, the ocean delivered one more lesson, a flaw that would rewrite everything they thought they knew about silence. It happened on a clear afternoon east of Bermuda. The Ghostfish was running a final endurance trial, testing how the alloy behaved under prolonged submersion. She had been underwater for 48 hours, maintaining a slow, steady speed of 5 knots. Inside, humidity clung to every surface. The air smelled of metal and oil. Lieutenant Commander Reese sat beside the sonar operator, listening to the steady rhythm of the escort ship's pings above them. Then came a sudden jolt, sharp, metallic, unmistakable. Something heavy had struck the hull. The submarine lurched. Instruments rattled. Engineers scrambled to check for leaks. Through the periscope, the surface shimmered empty. They guessed it had been floating debris, a piece of lost cargo, maybe a log. No one thought much of it until the next sonar burst rolled through the water. Silence. For 10 full seconds, no echo returned. The operator adjusted the gain. Nothing. He reset the frequency. Nothing. The escorts above continued to ping, sweeping the area, but the Ghostfish was gone. From their screens, from the ocean's map of sound. Even the submarine's own passive hydrophones detected only the faint hum of the escort's engines. The Ghostfish had become a ghost for real. Reese ordered a slow ascent to periscope depth. As they rose, the sonar officer recorded the entire event on tape. When the sub surfaced an hour later, the engineers found the source of the jolt, a dent the size of a dinner plate on the starboard midsection. The alloy had cracked inward, separating layers of steel and rubber bonding, leaving a small air cavity trapped inside. What should have been damage had somehow erased their acoustic footprint. Selby flew to Groton 2 days later, summoned by an urgent wire. When he examined the damaged panel, he was stunned. The microvoid between the layers acted like a perfect absorber. Sound waves entering the cavity reflected off multiple internal surfaces, losing energy each time until nothing escaped. In effect, the flaw had created a localized black hole for sonar, a point where echoes went to die. The realization was electric. For months, engineers had been chasing smoother, denser steel. Now they saw that roughness, void, and imperfection could be far more powerful. The lab reproduced the accident intentionally. They fabricated new panels with microcavities layered like honeycomb, sealing them under pressure. When submerged and pinged, the returns vanished almost completely. At certain frequencies, the panels absorbed up to 85% of the sonar pulse. They called it controlled cavity structuring, a name that said nothing yet contained the future of submarine stealth. Carl Yates saw the discovery for what it truly was, the beginning of an entirely new material science. He began sketching concepts for modular tiles, small detachable sections that could be glued to a hull and replaced after corrosion. Each tile would carry its own pattern of cavities tuned to specific sonar frequencies, creating a kind of sound camouflage. The idea seemed radical, but when Selby ran the math, it worked. The next generation of stealth wouldn't come from stronger steel. It would come from engineered surfaces that scattered sound like dust and wind. The excitement, however, collided with fear at the highest levels of command. A submarine invisible to sonar was also invisible to rescue. If one were lost, no search team could ever find it. The Navy's risk assessment warned that uncontrolled production might create unsanctioned acoustic ghosts in wartime. And there was another problem, the cost. Composition 14B was expensive, and its manufacturing required nickel and vanadium already critical for aircraft production. Each prototype hull consumed enough rare metal to build 10 fighters. The solution would have to wait. Still, the dent on Ghostfish changed the conversation forever. The engineers preserved that damaged hull plate in a crate labeled Section B, Anomalous Echo Absorption. It was later shipped to the Naval Research Laboratory and locked away in a vault. Selby reportedly visited it once more before the end of the war, tapping it lightly with his knuckle. It gave off no sound at all. In 10 minutes, that discovery would echo through decades. It would reappear in Cold War labs rebranded as polymer composites and anechoic tiles. But in 1944, it existed only as an accident, a dent in the side of a forgotten submarine, proof that even imperfection could hide in plain silence. By autumn of 1944, the Ghostfish lay moored in Groton under tarps that flapped gently against her hull. The Navy called it decommissioning, but to the men who had built her, it felt more like burial. The war's momentum had shifted. The Allies were pushing through France. U-boat losses had soared. Washington saw little need for experimental alloys when the end seemed close. Yet the engineers knew something the front lines did not. Sound itself had become the next battlefield, and America had already entered it. Robert Selby's final report ran to nearly 300 pages. It detailed every test, every anomaly, every echo or lack of one. At the end, he wrote a single sentence that stopped the review board cold. The ocean can no longer be trusted to tell the truth. It was half scientific warning, half prophecy. The Navy classified the report under special projects, and most copies vanished into safes that would not open again for decades. The Ghostfish was dismantled quietly that winter. Her hull sections were sent to the Naval Research Laboratory and to a small foundry in Pittsburgh for metallurgical analysis. Workers melted some pieces down, unaware that they were erasing the world's first sound-absorbing submarine. A few fragments survived, those that refused to melt evenly. The alloy's grain structure proved too unpredictable for standard recycling. One metallurgist noted, puzzled, that the steel remembers its silence. Meanwhile, Selby was reassigned to the Bureau of Ships, where he found himself designing propulsion bearings instead of acoustic materials. The war's end came not with triumph but with exhaustion. When news of Germany's surrender reached Washington, he was in his lab filing away unused samples of Composition 14B. He wrapped each piece in oilcloth, labeled it simply experimental, and stored them in a cabinet that would later be forgotten. Carl Yates left the Navy that same summer, joining a private research firm in Connecticut. He carried with him a single sketch, hexagonal tiles arranged in overlapping rows like the scales of a fish. In pencil he wrote, "For future sound control." No one in his new job understood it, but he kept the drawing folded in his wallet until the day he died. The official record said the project had been terminated for lack of operational utility. That phrase became a kind of cover story among officers who had seen the data. In truth, the Navy had decided that silence itself was too dangerous to mass produce. An invisible submarine could as easily vanish from command as from the enemy. During wartime, every new miracle had to be predictable, and Ghostfish was anything but predictable. So it was erased, struck from ship logs, expunged from test archives, remembered only in the minds of a few men who had heard the absence of an echo. Yet the silence did not die. In 1947, a small research grant appeared in the Naval Research Laboratory's budget, disguised under hydrodynamic surface tests. The files referenced a material called quiet depth compound. Its chemical signature matched the Ghostfish alloy. The Cold War was beginning, and sonar had returned as the frontier of fear. The Soviet Navy's new diesel boats prowled beneath Arctic ice, and American scientists scrambled to rediscover what had been hidden only 3 years earlier. The effort was no longer about steel. Polymers, rubbers, and resins took its place. Engineers realized they could mimic Composition 14B's micro-void structure, using synthetic materials far lighter and cheaper. Layered correctly, they formed skins that could swallow sonar pulses and dampen machinery noise. The new term was anechoic coating. It sounded harmless enough, bureaucratic and vague, but it was the rebirth of Selby's dream. When Selby retired in 1953, he received a letter stamped confidential. It thanked him for pioneering research in acoustic materials relevant to future naval applications. He never spoke of it to anyone, not even his family. He kept one relic on his bookshelf, a small square of the old alloy, darkened with rust, silent when struck. Visitors assumed it was a paperweight. He knew better. Across the ocean, British and Soviet scientists were chasing similar mysteries. Sonar had become the currency of the deep, and every nation wanted the power to disappear. Few realized that the first steps toward that invisibility had been taken in an unmarked shed beside the Thames River, in a war almost forgotten. The quiet that began as an accident now spanned oceans. The Ghostfish was gone, but her silence lingered. In new hulls, in sealed documents, in every sonar ping that never came home. The war had ended, but the listening never stopped. By the late 1950s, the world had learned to live with tension that hummed like a low-frequency sonar pulse, always there, always vibrating beneath the surface. The Cold War had divided oceans as surely as it divided continents. The United States and the Soviet Union each possessed fleets that circled one another in endless, invisible orbits. And deep beneath that rivalry, another contest had returned, the race to master silence. In a sealed laboratory at the Naval Underwater Sound Center in Newport, Rhode Island, engineers tested new materials on metal cylinders submerged in tanks of chilled salt water. The pings of experimental sonar sets echoed off each shape, plotted by oscillographs and recorded on reels of magnetic tape. Some metals sang like bells. Others, coated with black polymer sheets, whispered back faintly, as if reluctant to exist. Those black sheets were the descendants of Composition 14B, now reborn as rubberized anechoic tiles. Few of the scientists working in those rooms knew the true origin of the technology. To them, it was simply Project Quiet Depth, a modernization initiative meant to reduce noise from submarines. But buried in the classified references were the initials of a long-dead study, Section 14, Acoustic Hull Research. The ghost of Selby's alloy had resurfaced. The logic was simple. What the sonar could not hear, it could not kill. New Soviet sonar arrays had become far more powerful than their wartime counterparts, operating across multiple frequencies and capable of mapping the ocean floor. To survive, American submarines had to become ghosts once again. Engineers combined polymer chemistry with lessons from the old steel experiments, tiny cavities, layered composites, and frequency-tuned surfaces. By 1959, the Navy's first true silent hunter, the USS Skipjack, entered service with a sleek black hull that felt rubbery to the touch. Publicly, it was praised for hydrodynamic speed. Privately, it was celebrated for how little noise it made. Inside the Pentagon, older officers who had served in the Atlantic 2 decades earlier recognized the tone of the briefings. They remembered Ghostfish. One admiral even remarked, "We've come full circle, except this time we know what we're doing." But did they? The deeper the Navy ventured into silence, the more it faced a moral unease no report could quantify. Invisibility granted power, but it also erased accountability. A submarine could vanish under the guise of secrecy and never return. Its loss might not even register on sonar. Carl Yates's design sketches, found in an archive box by a new generation of engineers, guided the layout of modern tiles. The hexagonal patterns, originally drawn in pencil, were now produced by machines with atomic precision. Every cavity in the rubber had a purpose. Every void was tuned to devour a particular band of sound. One engineer compared the effect to painting darkness onto the sea. Yet for all the technological beauty, there was an undercurrent of dread. During tests near Key West, divers reported that swimming near a fully coated hull felt disorienting. The usual hum and echo of metal underwater were gone. The ship seemed to absorb not only sound but presence itself. One diver surfaced pale and shaken, claiming that when he touched the hull he couldn't feel where it began or ended. Supervisors dismissed it as exhaustion, but the unease lingered. By the early 1960s, the Navy's new generation of nuclear submarines, Thresher, Permit, and later Sturgeon classes, adopted full acoustic coatings. Each was faster, deeper, quieter than anything imagined in 1944. The irony was brutal. The first Thresher was lost in 1963 during deep-sea trials. Search vessels swept the area for weeks, their sonar beams probing miles of ocean. They heard nothing. No echoes, no returns, only silence. To this day, many engineers believe the very coatings meant to conceal her had also hidden her final cries. When the news reached Selby's old colleagues, some felt vindicated, others haunted. The alloy's legacy had outlived them all, but at a cost they could never have foreseen. Silence had become both shield and shroud. In 10 minutes, that realization would reach Washington and trigger a quiet revolution in naval philosophy. For the first time, the Navy commissioned a study on acoustic ethics, a bureaucratic phrase masking a simple fear. If the ocean could no longer speak, how would anyone know what had been lost beneath it? The engineers continued their work, of course. Progress never stops for conscience. They refined materials, improved adhesives, and learned to hide whole fleets beneath a layer of engineered hush. But in private, among those who remembered the early experiments, there was an understanding unspoken yet absolute. Every advance in silence carried with it an equal weight of erasure. The ocean was becoming a mirror that reflected nothing back. And deep inside its reflection, the ghostfish still swam unseen but never entirely gone. It always comes back to silence. Not the quiet of peace, but the stillness that follows when all the pings fade and the sea stops answering back. 80 years after the first test off Cape Cod, that silence remains, layered into every submarine hull that leaves an American shipyard, humming faintly beneath the surface of every ocean. The technology that began as an accident of steel has become a doctrine. The Navy no longer asks whether its boats can vanish. It asks only how long they can remain unseen. The ocean itself has changed. Modern sonar arrays sweep it endlessly, carving it into grids of mathematics. Yet there are regions, dark thermals, pressure layers, deep troughs, where sound bends away and disappears. In those voids, silence reigns. It is not empty. It is occupied by the descendants of a forgotten experiment, the heirs of Ghostfish. Each carries within its hull a trace of Selby's alloy, reimagined in polymers and composites, its ancestry unspoken but real. When those boats dive, even the whales fall silent around them. In archives long since declassified, a few faded documents tell the story's outlines. A memo from 1944 marked Section 14B. A photograph of a dented hull plate with rust blooming along its edges. A logbook entry reading simply "Echo Lost." To most historians, these are curiosities. To those who understand, they are the first footprints of an era when the boundary between sound and steel began to blur. Selby never lived to see his work rediscovered. He died in 1968, a retired scientist who spent his last years gardening and listening to shortwave radio. Neighbors recalled that he often paused while tuning, as if listening for something no one else could hear. At his funeral, a single Navy representative placed a folded letter on his coffin. It read only, "For services rendered to the science of silence." No medals, no ceremony, just acknowledgement that some contributions are meant to remain unheard. Carl Yates lived longer, long enough to see the first nuclear submarines glide into service. He visited one in 1972, the USS Narwhal, during its fitting at Portsmouth. Standing on the pier, he reached out and laid a hand on the hull. It felt warm, almost alive. "You can't hear her," a young officer said proudly. Yates smiled faintly. "That's what worries me," he replied. He walked away, and no one ever quoted him in official histories. The Cold War carried silence to perfection. By the 1980s, entire oceans had become arenas of acoustic chess, submarines tracking one another by the faintest propeller whisper or the ghost of a pressure wave. Those who mastered silence ruled the depths, and yet beneath the triumph, a quieter truth endured. No sonar operator, no engineer, no admiral ever again felt entirely certain that the sea told the whole story. The trust between man and ocean had been replaced by a standoff of echoes and absences. When the Soviet Union collapsed, many secrets surfaced, but the acoustic race did not end. Instead, it turned inward toward refinement. New materials, computer simulations, and nano-engineered surfaces replaced Selby's crude alloys. Yet even now, in naval research facilities from Groton to Yokosuka, samples of the old steel remain preserved in nitrogen vaults. Scientists test them not for strength, but for mystery. Decades later, Composition 14B still absorbs more sound than physics can fully explain. Some say the metal aged into something beyond its maker's understanding, a relic of a time when war forced men to chase silence faster than science could follow. Every ocean keeps its monuments. Some are wrecks, some are whispers. Off Bermuda, divers still report sonar shadows where none should be. Local fishermen call it the hole that won't answer. When explorers lowered a probe there in 1998, they found fragments of steel embedded in silt, thick, dark, oddly porous. Testing confirmed traces of nickel, manganese, and vanadium. The sample matched no known alloy. The report filed afterward ended with a line borrowed from Selby's own notes. The ocean can no longer be trusted to tell the truth. If you stand today on the same Cape Cod shore where that first sonar test went silent, you can still feel the hum of the Atlantic beneath your feet. The horizon looks unchanged. Gray water, low clouds, the hiss of distant surf. Somewhere far out there, a modern submarine moves unseen, its hull coated with generations of refinement born from one forgotten dent. Its crew hears the steady pulse of sonar and smiles, knowing the echo will never return. What began as a flaw became a philosophy. What began as an accident became the architecture of stealth. And what began as the quiet off Cape Cod became the sound of power itself, measured not in decibels but in the depth of its silence. For decades, America's secret steel has slept beneath the waves, invisible to machines that were built to find everything. And in that silence, the ocean still remembers the name no chart records. The Ghostfish, the submarine that taught the world to disappear,